Hello everyone, my name is Kishan Silvaratnayaka and I'm a solution engineer here at Broadcom, and today's topic that we're going to discuss is DX NetOps self-certification, and specifically focusing in on the self-certification aspect in performance monitoring. Self-certification is a process in which you can, as a user, as an end user, go in and certify new technologies or new vendors or new metrics that you want DX NetOps, the performance monitoring portion of DX NetOps, to be able to poll and collect performance data using Snmp. So if you take a look in here and zoom in some of these different use cases, you will see that there are different pieces to self-certification depending on the use case that you're trying to solve, right? So if it's a brand new technology that you're trying to poll in CAPM, then you'd have to create a new component and a metric family and a vendor certification. Again, we will go through these different pieces of self-certification in the next few slides, but this is kind of a breakdown of what an end user would need to do to self-certify depending on the different use case, right? If it's a new vendor that you want to support, again, depending on whether the technology is available out of the box or not, the steps you would take changes. Same way, if you want to add a new metric, right, you would just do some sort of extensions against out-of-the-box metric families and vendor certifications. Update a calculation, it's just updating a vendor cert. Then there's some enabling and disabling, baseline calculations, deviation calculation, metric family, min-max calculations for certain metrics. Again, that's an extension into the metric family. So depending on the use case, you would go in and update, extend, or create new certifications depending on what you want to accomplish, right? So let's take a look at what pieces are in a certification, right? So there are different certification components, three of them. One is the component, metric family, and the vendor certificate. A component basically defines what the class of the component is when it's discovered on the data aggregator as a component, and then it syncs over into Performance Center. That it defines what the class is for that component that's synced over to CAPC, and then also it defines whether a component is synced over to CAPC and how they are synced over to CAPC. So essentially, it's responsible for the sync definition between the DA, the data aggregator, and CAPC, right? And how it is represented within CAPC. So most of the time, these components that you create and that are discovered on the data aggregator show up on the device components, right? And then other components, you could, in the component definition, define that they would show up under a different section within the inventory items, right? So you can do that as well. Again, how do they show up within CAPC? That's what the component defines. The metric family essentially is a collection of your related metrics for a certain technology, technology being like CPU, memory, interface, right? So there's a whole bunch of metric families out of the box, right? If there's a new technology that you want to create, right, you could essentially go and create that collection of related metrics. And normally a metric family just contains a normalized form of the metric, right? It does not include any sort of details as to how it's going to go and poll that data for that particular metric. It's just the definition of that metric, right? What kind of, what the name of the metric is. Does it have any sort of unit, if it's a percent or if it's bytes, right, bits per second. Then it also defines whether you're going to calculate minimum and maximum, standard deviation, baselines against that metric. So the metric family contains a bunch of metrics, related metrics, and they're in a normalized form, right? And you would apply that metric family to a set of devices, right? And these metrics that you have, these normalized metrics, are what you see in CAPC within the views for reporting purposes. Again, in here, I've kind of put in a screenshot that kind of shows you for the interface metric family. Here's all the metrics that are available for you to report on, right? Bits in, bits out, utilization in, out, errors in, out, discards in, out, right? And a whole bunch of others, right? So that's what a metric family has. A vendor certificate essentially sits underneath a metric family, right? And that defines how certain metrics, how the data is gathered for certain metrics in a metric family, right? How are we going to poll? What OIDs are we going to poll to populate data against a particular metric in a metric family, right? So there are expressions within a vendor certification. There's a section that defines all the OIDs that we're going to poll, and then there's a section where there are expressions that map the metric family metric to the OID that we have just polled. And you can do any sort of expressions against those OIDs, take multiple OIDs, have certain if else then conditions, and any sort of mathematical equations. So all that's available within the vendor certification. So, and then a metric family can have multiple vendor certificates, right? Backing vendor certifications, depending on which vendor you have applied the metric family against. The data aggregator and the collector is able to understand which one is supported and then support that particular certification against that device and poll for those OIDs, right? So you can have there are some obviously standard certifications, and then also very specific vendor certifications that you would see against a metric family, right? So moving ahead, there are also self-certification web services that allow you to do self-certification. It allows power users with development level capabilities to export, import, extend or update any of these pieces within certifications, right? You can create new metric families and extend and update metric families. Same goes for vendor certifications. You can create custom components and even update out-of-the-box components. The URL for this REST endpoint is your data aggregator host 85 port 8581/type catalog, and once you go in there, you will see the different endpoints that are available for the metric families and the vendor certifications, right? And there's extended validation capabilities. So when you do an extension or create a new component metric family or a vendor certification, there's validation that takes place against the XML that you are sending the web service, so that it informs you if there's any sort of errors in your XML, and it points it out to the line number, and then you would have to fix that up and then resend it. There's a lot of documentation available with regards to self-certification and the web services and all the different pieces of a certification. For example, what are the different sections of the XML within the metric family, and what the tags are, and what are the valid data that you can send to this particular endpoint. So all that sort of data is available in the documentation. So I would highly recommend you take a look at the documentation to get up to speed on self-certification. All right, so what we'll do in the next few minutes is we'll go ahead and update an out-of-the-box certification to report on two metrics, right? Normally what you would expect, you would find out is, you have a certain metric family or some certification where it's not providing you some data against some metrics, or some certain metric is missing that you want to pull, right? So these are a very common use case that we come across. So in this case, I've kind of, when we looked at the self-certification use cases earlier at the beginning of the presentation, there were all these different use cases. So in this case, we are going to cover these particular two use cases. One where we are adding a new metric to an out-of-the-box certification, and another where we are kind of updating a calculation and expression, right? So the two metrics in the partition metric family that we are going to look on to is allocation units and allocation failures, right? So the allocation units metric is not something that's available out of the box, right? And it's available in the host resource storage vendor certification, okay? And the OID that we want to poll for is this particular OID, right? And then the other metric that we are looking for is the allocation failures. So allocation failures exist as a metric in the partition metric family, but there is no expression that pushes Snmp data into that particular metric in the host resource storage vendor certification. So what we are going to do in this exercise is we are going to create a new metric for allocation units in the partitions metric family, right? And then create a update the vendor certification, the existing vendor certification, to take this OID and then map it to this metric allocation units, right, that we are going to create. And then the allocation failures, is a metric that already exists in the metric family, but what we need to do in this case is figure out, how to add this OID into the out-of-the-box vendor certificate and map it to this allocation failures metric, right? So let's take a look. So first what we would need to do is understand, are we polling these OIDs, right? So it says here, allocation units is not a metric available, right? And this is the OID that we need to get, right? So since allocation units is not a metric, so let's go ahead and take a look at the partition metric family first, right? So I'm going to exit here and go into my CAPC UI, login. Oops. Okay, and I'm going to go to data sources, data aggregator, and then go into the metric families, right? And now we're looking at the partition metric family, so I'm going to look for partition, right? So if I look at the partition metric family, it shows it's factory, it's an out-of-the-box certification, and if I look for, we were looking for allocation units, right? So let's look for allocation units, right? So as you can see, this particular metric family does not contain the metric allocation units, and that's what has been asked from your customer, that they want to report on allocation units, right? So the first thing that we would need to do is update the out-of-the-box partition metric family and create this metric, right? So there's a process to do this. So the first thing that you would need to do is, since this is an out-of-the-box metric family, since it's a factory out-of-the-box metric family, what we would need to do is, in this case, we are going to extend the out-of-the-box metric family, right? So we're going to add something to something that is already there, right? So what we need to do is first understand what the internal name of this metric family is, right? The web services use the internal name of a metric family. This is the display name that you see, partition, but there's an internal name that you reference this particular metric family with. So if we go and hover over the name column and go to columns and click on internal name, this will give us what the internal name is. So there it is, normalized partition info, right? So I'm going to just, I'm going to copy that, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to the DA type catalog web services, which is the REST endpoint for anything to do with self-certification, right? So if I go to my next tab over, right? So I'm going to, my DA host colon 8581 slash type catalog, right? So when you go to the type catalog REST endpoint, you see that there's a bunch of endpoints available, and these are all related to self-certification. So in this case, we want to extend this metric family, right? So there's a metric family extension endpoint. We could go there, right? And then I'm going to double click here and then add the internal name of the partition metric family. What I'm doing here is I'm getting the XML definition of any sort of extensions that have been done to this particular metric family. So as you can see here, this is the definition of the extension portion of the partition metric family. You can also take a look at what the current definition of the normalized partition info metric family is. If you take the extension out and just go to normalized partition info, you see all the different metrics that are defined within this metric family for each metric, right? So, it gives you, here's the capacity metric and used, free, allocation failures, right, percent use. So all these different metrics, and you see for each metric, there's a definition as to, what kind of metric is it, the name, are we doing any sort of baselines, are we calculating minimum and maximums, right, standard deviation, what the roll-up strategy is for that metric. The roll-up strategy essentially defines, whether the calculation that you're doing against that is, it's kind of a gauge or a counter, right? So if the OID that you're backing this particular metric is a gauge, it would be an average. If it's a counter, it would be a sum, right? So the roll-ups are when PM does its hourly, daily, and weekly roll-ups, it would know how to, roll up that data. And then, are we doing any percentiles, any projections, right? So all that information is contained within the metric family definition for each metric, right? Then further down here, if we scroll down, there's some baseline definitions, if there are baselines that are defined. And then there is also the definition of the table, right? The table that this data gets stored in Vertica. So all that information is available within the metric family, right? So this is the current metric family definition out of the box, and what we're going to do is we're going to update this, and to do that we need to go into that extensions, right? So if I go back to the extensions, so what we want to do is we want to update this XML, right? And I've done some work on that previously, so I'll just bring that over. Right. So what we've done here is we've added this highlighted section into the extension XML for the normalized partition info. Essentially what we are doing is we are adding a new attribute section, right? We are adding a new metric, right, called allocation units. Right, we've specified what kind of, whether it's, what the type of the metric is, it's a double. You can specify some documentation. We've specified that there's not going to be any sort of baseline calculation. Minimum and maximum is not going to be calculated for now, right? No standard deviation, no percentiles, no projections, right? We've said it's the units for this particular metric is bytes, right? And the roll-up strategy is average. Now, the way we've figured this out is because in our outline here, it says that this particular OID is the allocation units metric, right? That's going to support this metric. So if I bring a MIB tool up and look at that particular metric, right? It says that the syntax is an integer. It does not say it's a counter. If it says it's a counter, then we would want to make sure that the metric that's holding that particular OID that would map to that OID would be a sum, right? So in this case it's an integer, so it's going to be an average. right? So we've created the attribute, and you may ask why, how do we know that this is supposed to be part of this particular attribute group, right? The reason is because when we looked at the out of the box certification, right, the metric family, right, you see here all these attributes, right, all the metrics show up under this particular attribute group, right? So we want to add that new metric into this particular attribute group. So, and all attributes, all metrics are a child of this attribute group. So that's the reason why we add this attribute group and then define our new metric underneath that attribute group, close the attribute group, right? So let's go ahead and send this over to the web. Okay, so I'm going to bring up my REST client. Okay. All right. So to update an out-of-the-box metric family, we need to perform a put. All right, and the body is going to be a string body, and I'm going to change this to application XML. All right, and then let's copy this XML and paste it in there. And the URL that you're going to send this to is the extension URL, right? So in our browser window, we went into the extension URL, right? DA host :8581/type catalog/metric families /extension /normalized partitions info, right? So that's what we're going to update, right? So, and here's the XML, and then I'm going to send it, right? And we're going to do a put, right? So now that validation takes place, right? And it says, great, HTTP 200, okay. So it says the metric family has been successfully uploaded. Oh, yeah. So now if we refresh, so this is the out of the box. Now if I refresh this, this shows, oh, look, there's my new metric that I just added, right? So now if we go to the metric family definition, not the extension, but the overall one, right? Now this metric should show up in here, right? So if I search for allocation units, there it is, right? So when you're looking at the metric family, it looks at the out of the box metric family and the extensions and then merges that and shows you the overall metric family that we've defined, right? So here's the new metric that we created. If we go to our, previously it didn't show that. Now if I search for that, let me refresh things here, right? Let's search for allocation, and there it is, allocation units, right? So there's my new metric. Now we have this new metric, and all we've done is we've created the metric in the metric family. We have not updated the vendor certification, and in our use case, we want to update the host resource storage vendor certificate with this OID, right? So we want to say when we poll this particular OID, we want to map this OID to this new metric that we created, right? So now to do that, let's go and search for the host resource storage vendor certificate, right? So if we could search for it, or even if we look through the vendor certification priorities, we should see host resource storage, right? So that's a certification that backs this particular metric family. So let's go and take a look, right? So you can see here allocation units shows up, but there is no metric expression, which means there is no OID that backs this up. So it's not going to populate with any data, right? So if you try to report on this particular metric now on a device, it's just going to say no data to display. Right. So we want to now find out first is, are we polling this OID to, in the vendor certification? If not, we would have to add it. If it is, fantastic. All we would need to do is update the certification so that we just map this OID to the new metric we just created, right? So let's take a look again. Just like the metric family, the vendor certifications also have an internal name, right? So to find out what the internal name is, we'll go back to name here, columns, internal name. There it is, HR storage mid. We will copy that and we'll go back to the main type catalog web service, right? And then go into the Snmp vendor certification, right? So we're going to look at the Snmp vendor certification. What we're trying to look for here is, are we polling for this OID out of the box, right? And I will show you what to look at. So again, just like the metric family, what we're going to do is we're going to go to that specific vendor certification, right? Okay, so here's the definition of that vendor certification, right? This defines, so you can see there's a difference, right? The metric family just had the metrics. In the vendor certification, you see OIDs. So this is for a specific vendor. What OIDs are we going to poll and populate certain metrics in a metric family, right? So in this case, we poll what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different OIDs, right? So these are the definitions of the OID. So in a vendor certificate, again, there's an attribute group, and then inside the attribute group, you define the OIDs you want to poll, right? So that's the one section. The other section of a vendor certificate is the expressions. The expressions define, which metric family. So the way a vendor certification understands which metric family backs is in this line right here where it says, normalized partition info, right? So this means this vendor certificate backs the partitions metric family, and within that, this destination attribute, this is the metric, again, the internal metric name within that metric family definition. This metric is backed by these particular OIDs and this expression, right? So each OID has a name that's associated with it. So you use the name within the expressions instead of using the OIDs. So you see, for example, storage used is used within all these different expressions, right? So this vendor certification is vendor cert is a little special. As you can see, this vendor cert populates data to 3 different metric families: the partitions metric family, the memory metric family, and the virtual memory metric family, right? So you can do that. A single vendor certification can support multiple metric families, right? So, but in our case, our use case is we are trying to see, if first this OID is being polled even within the out of the box. So if I do a Control F, all right. So you can see HR storage allocation units is being polled. But if we look for allocation units, right, it's being used in other expressions, but there is no definition here saying that for the partitions metric family, the allocation units OID should also map to the allocation units metric that we just created. So how would we go about doing that, right? Again, this would be an extension to the out-of-the-box vendor certification, right? So just as before, I have gone through this process and created the XML that we need to, send to this web service, right? So as you can see, I have the expression. We don't need to define the OID within the vendor certification because we've already, we've validated that, it's being polled, right, already in the vendor certification. So we don't need to add that. So what we would need to add is a new expression in the, the partition, for the partition metric, right? So if we go again, if I go back here and go to the extensions and look at that, right? So you can see here, here's the XML, the out of the box XML for the HR, host resource, storage, vendor certificate, extension section, right? So nothing has been extended, so we're just going to add to this, right? And this is what we've added. Again, we have to make sure that, when we are adding, for example, an expression, all the parent tags need to be part of that, right? So if we look at an expression for the partitions certification, I go back. Oops. Right, so you see here, there's an expression group, right? So for any expression in the partitions, it's part of this expression group. So we have to have this, and this is a expression. The expression group tag is a child of the expressions tag, right? So we've added all that to our XML, right? So that's what we've done. So let's go ahead and update our certification now. So again, we're going to go back to our REST client at this XML, right? Your URL is going to change, obviously. It's going to go to the extensions, right? For this, let's go to extensions and oops, I just did wrong thing there. HR storage mid, right? So that's what we are going to update. So that's going to be our URL, okay? And method is a put, right? And here's our body, and let's go ahead and send it. All right, so we got back a 200, which is good, and it says vendor certification has been successfully uploaded, right? So now if we go back to our UI, oh well, before we go to the UI, let's refresh this, right? So we see the change. So you can see it changed, and if we go to the regular vendor certification, that shows us the entire certification, not just the extension. Now you see for the partitions, there's a new expression for allocation units, and it adds the HR storage allocation units OID to it. All right, so now we'll go back to the vendor certification, right? And if I refresh this, see it's blank right now, refresh that, boom, right? So now going forward, any device that has this metric family associated with it and it's using the host resource storage vendor certification, it would now start collecting allocation units as a metric, and it will be stored in the database, and it will collect that data every 5 minutes, and then there will be roll-ups and all that, right? And then you'll be able to report on that metric within CAPC. All right, so that's how you would extend a metric family and a vendor certification. So in this case, we added a new metric to the metric family, right? And then updated the vendor certification so that we now start populating the data from an OID into that new metric that we just created, right? So that was the first requirement in our certification exercise, right? So the next one is this allocation failures. So we see that allocation failures exist as a metric already in the host resource vendor certification and the metric family, right? The partition, it's already a metric in the partition metric family, right? It's just that it's missing a metric expression, right? So again, similar exercise to allocation units that we just did, where the allocation units was there now, and now we added the metric expression. So we need to do something similar. So the first thing again is to understand, are we polling this particular OID, right? Because that is the OID that backs this particular allocation failures metric. All right, so let's go back to our vendor certification REST endpoint, right? So we're looking at the host resource storage vendor certificate. Let's now copy this, right, and search for this OID. All right, so this OID does not exist in this certification, right? So what that means is we are not polling for that OID. So what do we need to do to poll for that OID, right? So what we would need to do is, again, add to the extension of this particular vendor certificate, so that we now add a new attribute in the attribute section for this certification with the OID that we want to poll, right? So if we go back here, right, so we would need to add a new section in here with the attribute. Now, keep in mind, we've now already updated the host resource storage vendor certificate. We want, when you make an update, you want to make sure that you take the existing extension and then append to that, or else you will lose any changes that you've done previously, right? So you want to just add on to any changes that you already made previously. Okay, so I've gone through again, so this is what we had before, and now we're going to add to this. And once you make that change, this is what it's going to look like, right? So what we've done essentially is earlier we had allocation units, right? We've added this new expression called allocation failures, right? And then also added this new attribute, this OID, to poll, right, within this attribute group, right? Again, remember when we looked at let me just take this out. There we go. So when we look at this, right, so let me just collapse that. So within this attribute group is where all the OIDs exist that we're polling. So we want to add the new OID we want to poll into this particular attribute group, right? And that's what we've done. So we've taken this attribute group, same as before, and added this new attribute, right? And you see there's some tags here: is key, needs delta, source, right? So when you're defining a new new OID within a vendor certificate, you define the attribute. This is the name. What kind of what's the type of this attribute, this OID, right? There are different long, int, octet, string, right? So depending on the type of the OID, you can reference the documentation, to get all the different types. Then the isKey tag essentially defines when it does a discovery of the device and tries to understand, what certification is supported on that particular device. It uses these key OIDs within a certification to understand if all of them are supported. If all of those keys are supported for a particular certification, it's deemed that that certification, that vendor cert is supported on that device. Right? So in this case we've said yes, this is also going to be a key. Needs delta is this particular OID a counter, right? So if it's a counter, you want to get a delta so that it takes the previous value and the current value, and it only sends the data into the metric as the difference, right? The difference, since it's a counter. In this case, it is. If we look at this OID in a MIB browser, 3.1.7, right? So that's allocation failures. You see that it's a counter, right? So that's why we made sure that the needs delta tag is set to true. And then you have the source tag. Essentially, it's the OID that you want to pull. Okay, so that's the attribute definition. And then we just added a new expression to allocation failures, right? And we mapped the OID to the metric family metric. Now, to understand what the name of the internal name of this allocation failures is, within a metric family, you have to find that is using again the web services, right? So if you go to type catalog, right, and then go to the normalized partitions info, that's where the metric family definition is, right? And if you look for allocation failures, right, so you see here that's what you want to use in your vendor certification when you map things, the metric in a metric family to the OID, right? Because sometimes you can change the way it shows up in the UI. In the UI, as you can, if you may remember, there's a space, right? So, but that's just the display settings. But internally, there's no space, right? So that's what you would want to use in your XML. All right, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and perform a put again. We're going to send a put. As you can see, we still have the previous expression in here, because if you take that out, it will get removed, right? So we're going to do that, send it to the same extension. We are extending the same vendor certification, and we're going to perform a put, and let's go ahead and send that. Right, so great, fantastic. It came back and said, it's successful. Vendor certification has been successfully uploaded. All right, so let's take a look at the extension now. There we go. All right, so we are looking at the extension for this particular vendor certification, and as you can see now, the XML has been updated. Right, if we look at the overall vendor certification XML, right, you will see the new OID. There it is, right, and then in the expression group, there's the two new metrics, right, the two new different expressions that we've added. And then in here, you see that allocation failures is empty. Now once we update it, there we go, right. So hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of how to go about doing certifications. It's a matter of using the web services, the type catalog web services that will provide you access to be able to create and update and extend these certifications, and hopefully also gave you an understanding of what the structure of a metric family is and a vendor certification, and what are the different sections within each of those, and how you use them to create the certification and the updates that you need in the different sections. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video, and see you on the next one.